The summer heat pressed down on Manhattan like a heavy hand, turning the streets into rivers of shimmering asphalt and restless movement. Afternoon light slanted hard between the towers, carving sharp shadows across sidewalks where crowds flowed past coffee carts, impatient taxis, and storefronts that promised everything money could buy. The city breathed with its usual rhythm, loud, relentless, and indifferent to the small dramas unfolding in its corners. Marco Santoro stepped through the iron-framed doors of a private establishment on the Upper East Side, the kind of place without a sign, where entry required more than wealth. It demanded recognition. The building itself was old stone, darkened by decades of rain and exhaust, with narrow windows that revealed nothing of what happened within. He moved with the unhurried precision of a man who had long ago learned that speed was for the desperate. His suit was charcoal, tailored to fit without excess, the fabric catching light only when he moved. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a dull shine that suggested expense without advertisement. On his left hand, a gold ring bearing a family crest caught the sun briefly before disappearing back into shadow. He paused on the top step, eyes scanning the street with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent years reading danger in the tilt of a head or the lingering of a gaze. A black Maserati idled at the curb, engine purring low. Rocco sat behind the wheel, silent and watchful, his thick frame filling the driver's seat like a monument. Marco gave him a slight nod, then turned to navigate the crowd. The sidewalk was thick with tourists and businessmen, all moving with the fractured attention of people who believed themselves safe. Marco slipped between them, his presence somehow both visible and easily overlooked. He had perfected that balance over years, the art of being seen without being remembered. His phone buzzed once against his ribs. He ignored it. Whatever required his attention could wait. Timing, he had learned long ago, was about patience as much as precision. He had just stepped off the curb when a small body collided with his side. The impact was light, barely enough to shift his weight, but his instincts flared immediately. His hand moved to his chest, fingers brushing the inner pocket of his jacket where his wallet should have been. Empty. He stopped mid-stride, turned, and caught a flash of movement. A dark hoodie, small frame, quick feet disappearing into the crowd like smoke. Marco's expression didn't change. No anger twisted his features, no shout escaped his lips. He simply watched the direction she had gone, calculating distance and trajectory with the cold efficiency of a man who had hunted before. Then he moved. His stride was long and deliberate, cutting through the sidewalk traffic with an economy of motion that made obstacles seem to part for him. The girl ahead was fast, nimble in the way only children raised on hard streets could be. She ducked around a vendor selling pretzels, slipped past a cluster of teenagers taking photographs, and turned sharply into a side street. Marco followed, his breathing steady, his focus absolute. He didn't run. He pursued. The side street narrowed into an alley lined with fire escapes and dumpsters, the kind of passage the city tried to forget. The girl glanced back once, her eyes wide and dark beneath the shadow of her hood, and Marco saw something flicker there. Not defiance, not cruelty, just calculation. She was measuring him, deciding if he would follow or give up like so many others probably had. He gave her no answer, only kept coming. She took a hard right into a loading bay, scrambling over a pile of discarded pallets with the grace of someone who had navigated worse. Marco vaulted the same obstacle without breaking stride, his hands steady, his breathing controlled. The alley opened into a narrow dead end behind a bodega, brick walls rising on three sides, too high to climb. The girl spun around, chest heaving, and for the first time since the chase began, she had nowhere left to run. Marco stopped 10 feet away, hands loose at his sides. He didn't reach for anything, didn't threaten. He simply stood there, silent and immovable, his dark eyes fixed on her face. The hood had fallen back during her flight, revealing a tangle of curls, a smudged cheek, and eyes that held far too much weariness for someone so young. She clutched his wallet against her chest like a shield. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise faded into the background, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of traffic. Marco tilted his head slightly, studying her. She was maybe 11, maybe 12. Her jeans were frayed at the knees, held together more by habit than thread. One sandal was broken, the strap dangling uselessly. There was a thin scar on her forearm, recent enough to still be pink. "You picked the wrong pocket," Marco said finally, his voice low and even, barely louder than a conversation across a dinner table. There was no anger in it, no threat, just statement. The girl said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the wallet, but she didn't look away. She was bracing for something, he realized, waiting for the blow, the shout, the violence. He had seen that posture before in people who had learned to expect the worst. "I could make one call," he continued, still in that same quiet tone. "You'd be gone before sunset." Her breath hitched, but she held his gaze. Marco noticed the way her shoulders squared despite the trembling in her hands, the way she positioned herself as if ready to take whatever came. Brave, he thought. Foolish, but brave. "What do you need it for?" he asked, and this time there was something different in his voice. Not softness exactly, but curiosity. The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her lips parted, then closed. She looked down at the wallet, then back up at him. "I wasn't going to keep it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, rough with exhaustion. Marco waited. "I just needed cash," she continued, the words coming slowly, carefully. "Just enough for something. I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off, but her eyes remained fixed on his face, searching for something she wasn't sure she would find. "What's something?" Marco asked. He took a single step closer. She tensed but didn't retreat. Couldn't. Behind her was only brick. She looked away, down at the cracked pavement between them. When she spoke again, her voice was even quieter. "My mom, she's sick." The words settled in the air between them like stones dropping into still water. Marco's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had heard every excuse, every story, every desperate plea that desperation could invent. But there was something in the way she said it, not begging, not performing, just stating a truth too heavy for her to carry alone. "She's real sick," the girl added, and now she held the wallet out toward him, arms extended. "You can take it back. I didn't want to steal from you. I didn't want to steal from anybody. I just didn't know what else to do." Marco stared at the wallet, then at her face. She wasn't crying. There was no drama in her posture, no manipulation in her eyes, just exhaustion and something that looked uncomfortably close to resignation. He reached out slowly and took the wallet from her hands. His fingers brushed hers briefly. They were cold, too cold for a summer afternoon. He opened the wallet, checked its contents. Everything was there. Cards, cash, identification. She had taken nothing. "She's really sick?" he asked, not a challenge, just confirmation. The girl nodded. "They said she needs medicine, but we can't. People don't care when you ask." Marco slid the wallet back into his jacket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He adjusted his cuff, revealing the edge of a watch face, simple and expensive. Then he looked at her again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight. "Where do you live?" The girl hesitated. "You going to call the cops?" "I asked where you live." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read intentions in the lines around his eyes. Then she turned slightly, nodding toward the alley entrance. "Not far." Marco gestured with one hand. "Show me." She blinked, surprised. "What?" "Show me your story," he said simply. "Let's see if you're telling the truth." For another heartbeat, she stood frozen, caught between distrust and desperate hope. Then she turned and started walking. Marco followed, his footsteps steady behind hers as they left the dead end and emerged back into the noise and light of the city. Neither spoke, but something had shifted between them. A thread had been pulled, fragile and uncertain, connecting two people who had no reason to trust each other and every reason not to. But sometimes, Marco knew, the most important decisions were made in moments like these, when logic stepped aside and something older, something more human, took its place. The girl walked ahead of him through the shifting crowds, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to navigate streets that didn't welcome her. Marco followed at a measured distance, close enough to keep her in sight but far enough to give her space. He noticed the way she avoided certain corners, how she kept to the edges of buildings, instinctively staying in shadow. This wasn't her first time leading someone through the forgotten parts of the city. The neighborhood changed gradually as they walked. The gleaming towers and polished storefronts gave way to older buildings with chipped paint and cracked windows. The sidewalks became uneven, buckled by tree roots and neglect. Street lamps bore the scars of rust and graffiti. The air grew thicker, carrying the mingled smells of hot oil, gasoline, and something sour that spoke of too many people living too close together with too few resources. Marco registered every detail. The liquor store with bars on the windows. The convenience mart where teenagers loitered on the steps, watching everyone who passed with the lazy assessment of predators deciding whether something was worth their attention. The girl slipped past them without acknowledgement, and they didn't call out to her. That silence told Marco more than words could. She belonged to this place, and it had taught her how to move through it unseen. They turned down a narrow alley between two brick buildings that looked ready to surrender to gravity. At the end stood a door, green paint flaking away to reveal rust beneath. The girl pushed it open without needing a key. The lock had been broken long ago. Marco followed her inside. The hallway beyond was dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered with the irregular rhythm of failing electricity. The smell hit him immediately. Mildew, rot, trapped heat, and beneath it all, the sour tang of poverty that no amount of cleaning could erase. The carpet was worn through in places, revealing stained concrete beneath. Somewhere above, a baby cried. A door opened 3 units down, and an old woman peered through a gap secured by a chain lock. Her eyes found Marco, widened slightly, then the door shut again without a word. The girl nodded toward a staircase. The elevator beside it was clearly defunct, its doors held open by a piece of wood wedged into the track. "Third floor," she said quietly. They climbed. Each step groaned beneath their weight. The walls were covered in layers of paint that had bubbled and peeled over the years, revealing different colors beneath like geological strata. By the time they reached the third landing, Marco's breathing was steady, but the air itself felt heavier, stale, and unmoving. The girl stopped at a door marked with a paper star, the tape curling at the edges. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Marco followed, ducking slightly through the low doorframe. The apartment was small, not cozy small, but suffocating small. 3 paces wide, with a ceiling that seemed to press down and walls stained dark at the corners where moisture had seeped through during countless winters. A fan turned slowly in one corner, its blades clicking with each rotation like a countdown. There were no pictures on the walls, no decorations, just the bare necessities of survival. A mattress on the floor, a table propped up on one side by a stack of magazines, and in the far corner, slumped in a worn armchair, a woman. Marco's eyes went to her immediately. She wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too shallow, too irregular. Her skin gleamed with sweat despite the fan's efforts, and her hand twitched occasionally with small, involuntary movements. Her hair was damp, plastered to her forehead in dark coils. She wore a thin cotton dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to ghost shapes. Everything about her spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. The girl dropped to her knees beside the chair, pulling a crumpled cloth from a bowl of water and wiping her mother's face with a gentleness that made something tighten in Marco's chest. The gesture was practiced, routine, the kind of care that came from repetition rather than instruction. "She's been getting worse," the girl said, glancing back at Marco. "The fever started yesterday, but she ran out of her pills 3 days ago." Marco stepped closer, his eyes taking in the rest of the room now. A box fan, an empty bottle of Tylenol, a plastic pharmacy bag with a crumpled receipt. On the table, a small notebook lay open, filled with careful handwriting that tracked medications, times, symptoms. Someone had been trying desperately to manage an illness that required far more than good intentions. He looked at the woman again. Her chest rose and fell with effort. There was a small adhesive patch visible at the collar of her dress, medical grade but old and peeling at the edges. "She had a heart episode," the girl explained quietly, following his gaze. "Back in February, they gave us a month's supply of patches, said it would help stabilize her rhythm, but they told us we'd need to get refills on our own." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "No insurance. Too expensive." She didn't sound angry, just tired, resigned, like someone who had stopped expecting the world to make sense or be fair. Marco pulled out his phone, already scrolling through his contacts. "I'll make a call," he said. "We'll get help here." The girl's head snapped up, eyes wide. "No, please. She doesn't want to go to the hospital. She said they'd just leave us with more debt. They already turned us away once." Marco stopped, his finger hovering over the screen. "They turned you away?" The girl nodded. "We tried last month when she couldn't breathe. We waited 6 hours in the ER. Then they told us we needed to see a specialist. We couldn't pay the consult fee up front, so they gave us Tylenol and told us to follow up with primary care." She looked at her mother, then back at him. "We don't have primary care." Marco stared at her, something cold and sharp moving through his chest. He had seen injustice before, had been part of systems that operated outside the law, but this was different. This was a child watching her mother die because bureaucracy valued paperwork more than life. Before he could respond, the woman, Angela, coughed. It was a harsh, dry sound that rattled in her chest like stones in a can. Her body jolted once, then went slack. The girl leaned in immediately, shaking her gently. "Mama," she whispered, voice tight with panic. "Mama, wake up." No response. Marco was already dialing. When the operator answered, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that didn't allow for questions. "Medical emergency. Unconscious female. Possible cardiac distress. Third floor." He gave the address, then ended the call and moved toward the woman, his fingers finding her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak, irregular, but present. "She's alive," he said, looking at the girl. "They're coming." The girl clutched her mother's hand, her voice breaking. "She does this sometimes, but she always wakes up. Please, she has to wake up." Marco knelt beside them, one hand resting on the girl's shoulder. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Matilda," she whispered. "Matilda, listen to me. Your mother is strong. She's fought this long because of you. She'll keep fighting." In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder. Marco stayed where he was, his presence solid and steady beside this child who had stolen from him less than an hour ago, and who now represented something he couldn't quite name. Not obligation, not pity, but something closer to recognition. He saw in her desperation something he understood, the refusal to surrender even when every rational calculation said the fight was lost. The sirens grew closer and Marco made a decision. Not with words, not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of staying. Of not walking away when walking away would have been easier, safer, more rational. He had spent his life making calculated choices, weighing risk against reward, survival against sentiment. But sitting in that stifling room, watching a child beg her unconscious mother to breathe, he chose something different. He chose to care. The ambulance arrived with a chaos of red lights and urgent voices. Two paramedics burst through the door with a stretcher, their movements efficient and practiced. One knelt beside Angela, checking vitals while barking questions Marco answered with clipped precision. The other unrolled equipment, preparing for transport. Matilda refused to let go of her mother's hand. "Please be careful," she kept saying, her voice cracking. "Please don't let her die." One of the paramedics, a tall man with kind eyes, looked down at her. "We'll do everything we can, sweetheart." They lifted Angela onto the stretcher. Her arm fell limply to the side, and Matilda gently tucked it under the sheet, her fingers trembling. Marco followed them down the narrow staircase, the stretcher barely fitting through the tight turns. Outside, they loaded Angela into the ambulance. Matilda tried to climb in after her, but a paramedic stopped her gently. "Only one," he said. Matilda looked at Marco, her eyes pleading. "She's with me," Marco said, his voice allowing no argument. "I'll bring her." He watched the ambulance pull away, sirens screaming, then turned to Matilda, who stood on the sidewalk barefoot, her broken sandal forgotten somewhere in the rush. "Come on." Rocco had appeared as if summoned, the Maserati idling at the curb. Marco opened the back door and Matilda climbed in without hesitation. During the drive to Lenox Hill Hospital, she stared out the window, whispering under her breath. Marco caught fragments. "Please let her live. Please don't let her go." They reached the emergency entrance minutes after the ambulance. Marco's presence changed things immediately. Doors opened, staff appeared. Within moments, they were inside, bypassing the waiting room, ushered to a corridor outside the trauma unit. A nurse handed Matilda water she didn't drink. Marco spoke quietly with the supervising physician, his words few but weighted with the kind of influence that didn't require explanation. Then two uniformed NYPD officers arrived. They were led in by hospital security, their expressions professional but purposeful. The older one, stocky with thinning hair, scanned the hallway before his eyes settled on Marco. "Mr. Santoro," he said, not a question. Marco turned slowly. "Officer, we received a report, surveillance footage from Midtown. A juvenile matching the description of—" He glanced at Matilda. "Her, there's a prior citation, shoplifting warning from 2 months ago. We're obligated to follow up." Matilda's face went pale. "I gave it back," she whispered, stepping slightly behind Marco. "He knows. I wasn't trying to—" The younger officer moved toward her. "Ma'am, we just need to ask a few questions downtown. Routine." Marco stepped forward, positioning himself between Matilda and the officers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She's 11. Her mother is fighting for her life behind that door. If you want to question her, you do it here. Now." The older officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, she has a prior. We have reason to believe she may be connected to a pattern of thefts. We need to bring her in." The younger one reached for the cuffs on his belt. "Don't," Marco said. One word, flat, final. The officer hesitated. "She's not armed," Marco continued, his eyes locked on the officer's face. "She's not violent. She's a child who just watched her mother collapse. You want to put cuffs on her?" A beat of silence stretched between them. Then the younger officer lowered the cuffs. "Then step aside so we can escort her properly," the older officer said. Matilda's shoulders shook. "I don't want to go. Please, I want to stay with my mom." Marco didn't look away from the officers. "I'm her temporary guardian," he said, the words surprising even himself. "You want to file paperwork? Do it later. Right now, she stays." "That's not how this works," the officer replied. "Then make it work." A doctor emerged from the trauma bay at that moment, clipboard in hand, scrub stained. "Mr. Santoro, Angela's stable for now, but it's serious. We're moving her to cardiac ICU. The next few hours are critical." Matilda tried to push forward, but the officer instinctively blocked her path. She started to cry, not with loud moans, but with the silent, dry kind of crying that comes from being completely helpless. Marco looked at her, then at the officers. "She's not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not until she knows her mother's out of danger. If you want to arrest someone, arrest me for obstruction. But if you take one step closer to her, I will make sure your precinct has reporters camped outside by sunrise." There was a moment of complete stillness. Then the older officer sighed and stepped back. "We'll wait, but we're not walking away." "Good," Marco said. "You'll stay right here." He turned to Matilda and rested a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it as slightly, still crying but grounded by the pressure. Marco knelt to eye level. "You're okay," he said. "I won't let them take you. Just breathe. I'm here." She nodded slowly, her breath ragged. Behind them, machines beeped steadily through the closed doors, the sound of life persisting against impossible odds. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marco didn't feel like an observer in someone else's crisis. He felt responsible, entwined. Not because he had to be, but because something in him, something he'd thought long buried, had chosen to be. And that choice, he realized, would change everything. The hallway outside the ICU was designed for waiting, cold linoleum floors, harsh fluorescent lights, and chairs that discouraged comfort. Marco sat with his back straight, legs crossed, the posture more habit than ease. Beside him, Matilda had curled into herself, arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. She hadn't spoken in several minutes. Her face was dry, but only because there were no tears left. Inside the ICU, Angela lay unconscious, connected to machines that blinked and beeped in rhythmic reminders of how fragile life had become. The initial treatment had stabilized her, but the doctor's explanation had been clear and grim. Advanced cardiac failure. More severe than they'd realized. She needed medication that wasn't readily available, something still in clinical trials overseas, something expensive and nearly impossible to obtain on short notice unless someone had the right connections. Marco had stood there listening, arms folded, jaw set, while a cold fury built inside him. Not at the doctor, not at the hospital, but at a system that allowed life to hang on pharmaceutical shipping schedules and regulatory red tape. Now, sitting in the waiting area, he felt that familiar twitch of control slipping, something he hadn't experienced in years. Matilda stirred beside him. "She used to sing to me at night," she said suddenly, her voice flat and distant. "Even when she was tired, even after her shifts. Just whispered lullabies because we didn't want the neighbors to hear." Marco nodded slowly, acknowledging the offering of something precious. Matilda glanced up at him, eyes shadowed. "Do you think she knows I'm here?" Marco looked toward the closed ICU doors. "Yes, I think she does." A nurse appeared, carrying a folded blanket. "Honey, why don't you lie down for a bit? It'll be a while before we have any changes." Matilda shook her head. "I need to be awake when she wakes up." The nurse gave her a small, understanding nod and turned to Marco. "If you need anything, the lounge is just around the corner." Marco waited until she left, then stood and walked down the hall to the small lounge. A vending machine hummed in the corner. A beige phone hung on the wall like a relic. He pulled out his personal phone and dialed a number from memory. The man who answered spoke with a European accent, cultured and cautious. "Marco, it's been a while." "I need something moved," Marco said without preamble. "Medical. From Sweden. Tonight." There was a pause. "That's complicated." "I know, that's why I'm calling you." Another pause, longer this time. "What's the cargo?" "Stelnex, clinical trial medication. Cardiac application. That requires approvals, signatures, customs." "I don't care what it requires," Marco said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "Get it on a plane. I'll handle the rest on this end." "Marco, if this goes wrong..." "It won't. Do it." Silence, then a soft exhale. "For you, but you'll owe me." "Put it on my account." Marco ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He had spent years building a network of favors and debts, connections that stretched across oceans and through shadows. He had never used them for something like this. But he would now. When he returned to the hallway, Matilda was asleep, or trying to be. His jacket was wrapped around her shoulders like a blanket. He sat down beside her, closer this time, and watched the red numbers on the clock above the nurse's station crawl forward. Hours passed. Marco made more calls, speaking in low tones, pulling strings, bypassing systems that weren't meant to bend. He arranged legal paperwork to establish himself as Matilda's emergency proxy guardian. He called in favors from lawyers, from hospital administrators, from people who understood that when Marco Santoro asked for something, there was usually a very good reason. When Matilda stirred, he was there. When she asked about her mother, he answered honestly. And when she finally looked up and asked the question he knew would come, "Are we going to lose her?" He didn't offer false comfort. He reached out, took her hand, and said, "Not if I can help it." And for the first time, she believed him. Not because of his money or his influence, but because in the cold, antiseptic quiet of that hospital corridor, he had chosen to stay, to listen, to care, not from obligation or guilt, but from something harder to name, something that whispered that if he didn't fight for this child, then what did all his power mean? The call came at 3:17 in the morning, sharp and jarring, breaking the fragile quiet. Marco had drifted into a half-sleep, one hand still loosely near Matilda's arm. He jolted upright as the nurse answered the wall phone, her eyes flicking toward him. "Mr. Santoro, they need you in the ICU. It's urgent." He stood, heart already racing, and touched Matilda's shoulder. "Stay here, Victor." But Matilda was awake, eyes wide. "Is it my mom?" The nurse hesitated. "Come with me." They followed her down the corridor. When they reached the ICU command center, the lead physician was waiting, scrubs damp with effort, exhaustion carved into his features. "She's entering cardiac distress," he said immediately. "We've done everything protocol allows, but her heart rhythm's deteriorating. We're at a point where we either watch her slip away or we take a chance. He paused. That drug you arranged, Stellenex. It arrived an hour ago, but it hasn't been cleared for emergency cardiac use in this country. If we administer it, we'll need to stop her heart momentarily and restart under controlled conditions. That's high risk in someone as compromised as she is. Marco's mouth was dry. And if we don't use it, she won't survive the night. Silence stretched thin. The doctor turned his tablet toward Marco. We need consent, legal release. The hospital won't touch it unless we have it in writing. She's unconscious. That leaves you as the emergency proxy. Marco stared at the screen. Blank fields and signatures. A digital line between life and liability. His hand hovered above the stylus. Wait, Matilda whispered, stepping forward. If it's the only way, why are you hesitating? Her gaze was on Marco now, not angry, but imploring. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to say. If Angela died because of the drug, it would be on him. His decision, his responsibility. I've seen this before, he said quietly. People make desperate choices. Sometimes desperation isn't enough. Matilda's lips trembled. She didn't want to go to the hospital because she knew we couldn't afford it. She told me to be strong, to find a way. She gave up asking for help years ago. But I didn't. I found you. Her voice broke. You said we had a chance. You said we could try everything. Please don't let her down now. Marco felt something sharp twist in his chest. He looked down at Matilda, this girl who had stolen his wallet and somehow taken so much more. His assumptions, his comfort, his control. He looked at the stylus again. His fingers moved slowly, but deliberately. He signed. The doctor took the device, already barking orders. Prep the defibrillator. Start the cooling protocol. We're going. Matilda was led to a viewing window. Marco followed, standing behind her as nurses streamed in and out. Angela lay motionless, pale against the sheets, machines breathing for her. The rhythm on the monitor was erratic, a skipping drumbeat of danger. Matilda pressed her forehead to the glass. Please fight. Just fight for me. One more time. The procedure began. They cooled Angela's core temperature. The cardiologist counted down. 3, 2, 1. Initiate arrest. The monitor flatlined. A high, piercing tone filled the room. Marco gripped the windowsill. Matilda clamped her hands over her ears, tears pouring down her cheeks. Stellenex administered, the doctor called. Begin countdown for reactivation. Seconds passed like stones dropping into water. Slow, heavy, echoing, clear. The defibrillator paddles met Angela's chest. First jolt, no change. Second jolt. The tone wavered. Third time, the monitor beeped. Faint, uneven, but there. We've got a pulse, a nurse shouted. Blood pressure rising, heart rhythm stabilizing. The room burst into organized chaos, but the tone had changed from desperation to hope. The doctor emerged 20 minutes later, sweat on his brow, eyes bloodshot but steady. She's not out of the woods, but she's responding. The drug bought us time. Marco looked down at Matilda, who looked up at him, eyes red but wide. He didn't say anything. He simply extended his arm. She reached for it, and together they stood there, side by side, on the other side of a choice that might have saved a life and had definitely changed two more. Dawn arrived slowly, bleeding through the ICU windows in pale streaks. Outside, the city woke with its usual noise. But in this quiet corner of Lenox Hill Hospital, time moved differently. Angela lay still, chest rising and falling with a mechanical precision, tethered to beeping monitors. She hadn't moved since the procedure, but the doctors said that wasn't unusual. The body needed time. Marco sat nearby, the hours since resuscitation blurring into a kind of trance. Calls, consultations, sterile coffee. Moments of watching Matilda sleep, curled in the corner like she was afraid someone might take the space from her. A nurse tapped gently on the glass. She's awake. You can come in, just for a moment. Matilda was on her feet before the sentence finished. She moved barefoot down the corridor into the recovery room. Marco followed at a slower pace, hanging back inside the doorway. Angela's eyes were open, dull with exhaustion, but unmistakably present. The way they locked on her daughter's face, first with confusion, then recognition, sent a visible shiver through Matilda. "Mom," she whispered, voice cracking. "Mama, you're back." Angela couldn't speak. The breathing tubes rendered words impossible, but her lips parted slightly and her fingers twitched. Matilda rushed to her, careful of wires and tubes, and took her hand with both of hers. "I thought I lost you, but he helped. Mr. Marco, he found the medicine. He stayed with me." She glanced over her shoulder. Marco gave her a small nod. Angela's eyes shifted to Marco, slow and glassy, but with something that resembled recognition. There was no thanks, no expression, only a flicker of something quiet and human and incredibly fragile. Then her eyes closed again, her grip on Matilda's hand loosening but not releasing. The nurse stepped forward. "She needs to rest now." That moment took everything she had. Matilda leaned in and kissed her mother's forehead, then followed Marco back into the hallway. Once outside, she sat on the bench, folding herself inward. Marco sat beside her. "She saw you," he said. "She knows you're here." Matilda nodded, slow and stiff. "But she's not better yet." "No, but she's alive." A doctor approached, younger this time, with a clipboard and the subtle fatigue of someone who hadn't left the building in 2 days. He introduced himself as Dr. Nike and began speaking in measured tones. "The drug stabilized her heart. Her organs are responding. That's a win. But the complications from the arrest and fever spike left some damage. We ran neurological tests this morning. As of now, she's not responding to any stimulus from the waist down." Matilda's head jerked upward. "What does that mean?" "It could mean temporary paralysis. The nerves may still be in shock. But we're also looking at potential spinal trauma. We'll run MRIs to confirm. For now, we have to treat it seriously." Matilda's eyes filled. "She won't be able to walk." "We don't know yet. Recovery could take time. Physical therapy, long-term care. She's going to need help." The words hit harder than any diagnosis. After the terror and the miracle, there was still the long road of reality. When the doctor left, Marco pulled out a small notepad. "I've been making calls. There's a rehabilitation center in Westchester. One of the best. Quiet, private. I've already reserved a room." Matilda looked at him confused. "But we don't have money for that." "You don't need it." "But what happens after that? Where do we go? We don't have a place anymore. If Mama can't work again, how are we supposed to live?" Marco stared at the floor, then lifted his gaze to hers. "That's something I'd like to talk to your mother about. But if she agrees, I'd like to help with more than just the hospital. I have space, too much of it, and I've spent years building things for people who already had everything. I think it's time I built something for someone who actually needs it." Matilda didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked. After a long moment, she reached over and took his hand. Not with gratitude, not even hope, just connection. Real, quiet, and full of meaning. They sat like that for a long while, two people bound by something that hadn't existed days earlier. A shared battle, a shared fear, and now maybe the first thread of a shared future. The private van eased down the tree-lined driveway, tires hushed against gravel, morning sun painting long shadows across the front steps of Marco's estate. The house rose before them, stone and iron, beautiful but not ostentatious. Old money rendered in architecture, the kind of place where wealth had been spent quietly. Angela sat upright in the back seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes alert despite exhaustion. Her wheelchair was secured beside her. Matilda sat close, watching her mother as if afraid she might vanish again. No one spoke. The moment carried its own weight. When the door opened, Matilda stepped out first, then helped guide the wheelchair down the ramp with careful precision. Marco waited, holding the door wide, not rushing, simply standing as Angela took in the sight before her. "This can't be where we're staying," Angela murmured, voice still rough from medication. Marco nodded slowly. "It's home, for as long as you want it to be." Inside, the scent of lemon and old wood lingered, clean and lived in. The foyer opened into a wide hallway bathed in soft amber light from wall sconces. A nurse greeted them gently, taking Angela's medical bag. Another staff member wheeled essentials toward the guest suite Marco had prepared. Lowered bed, accessible bathroom, sunlight through south-facing windows. But Angela's eyes weren't on the decor. They were fixed on her daughter, then on Marco, her expression hard to read. Dinner that evening was quiet, not tense but new. The dining room held the clink of silverware and soft rustle of fabric. Angela ate little. Matilda talked more than usual, filling silences with comments about the soup, the garden visible through the window. Marco answered softly, politely, but there was something between Angela and him, respectful yet guarded. She refused help adjusting her wheelchair. She insisted on reaching the water pitcher herself. When Marco stood to refill her glass, she held up a hand. "I've got it." Gentle but firm. He sat back without a word. Later that night, after Angela had been helped into bed and the house quieted, Marco remained in his study. Amber light from his desk lamp pulled across papers he wasn't reading. That's when he heard soft footsteps. Matilda stood in the doorway holding a glass of milk. "Can I sit?" Marco gestured to the armchair. She climbed into it, curling her legs beneath her. "I wanted to say something, not because I'm supposed to, because I need to." Marco waited. "I'm sorry I stole from you. Really sorry. Not just because it was wrong, but because you didn't deserve it. You were just walking, and I took from you like it meant nothing. But it did. I didn't see you as a person, just a solution. That wasn't fair." Marco's throat tightened. "I thought if I could just get money fast, I could fix everything. But I didn't think what it would cost someone else. And still, you helped. You didn't make me feel like trash. You stayed. You saved her. You saved us." Silence stretched. Then Marco leaned forward. "Matilda, I've had people steal more than money from me with contracts and handshakes. None of them ever says sorry. You did. That matters." She looked at him, eyes wet. "You still trust me?" "I do now, because trust isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after." She nodded quietly. "I want to be someone you're proud of." Marco smiled, soft and genuine. "You already are. You've been braver in the past week than most people are in a lifetime." The next morning, early light filtered through gauzy curtains. Angela sat by the window in the guest suite, wrapped in a shawl, watching wind play through the garden. Marco entered carrying 2 cups of tea, hesitating before setting one beside her. She nodded thanks, then gestured for him to sit. For a while they watched the trees. Then Angela cleared her throat. "I used to pray, every night, not for miracles. I knew better. Just for a crack of light, some kind of kindness. After a while I stopped. Didn't think anyone was listening anymore." She turned to face him. "But then you showed up. I know that might sound foolish to someone like you. But to me, you were the answer. The thing I couldn't imagine but still begged for." Marco tried to downplay it, but Angela raised her hand. "Don't. Let me say it. You didn't just save my life. You gave my daughter back her hope. I will never be able to repay you, but I will remember it every day I'm still breathing." Marco looked at her, words catching. He placed his hand gently over hers. She let it stay. That afternoon, Matilda taped a piece of paper to the refrigerator. Hand-drawn, rough around the edges, but vibrant. 3 stick figures, one in a wheelchair with a big smile, one with curly hair holding a flower, one tall figure in a dark suit standing between them. Above it, in uneven handwriting, "Home." Marco found it later, paused in front of it longer than he meant to. He didn't move it, didn't comment, just stood, eyes stinging, letting that single word sink into places he hadn't visited in years. For the first time in decades, the house felt lived in, warm, like something was growing, slowly and unexpectedly, into something real, something worth keeping, something that maybe looked like family. The mornings had taken on a rhythm, not routine yet, but something close. Angela would be wheeled into the sunroom just past 8, dressed in soft tones, hair brushed by Matilda, who took the task more seriously than anything else. She'd sit near the window overlooking the garden where birds flitted between branches. Marco would arrive shortly after, coffee in hand, dressed more casually these days. Sleeves rolled, no tie. They didn't speak much early on. The quiet had become a language built on shared recovery, unspoken respect, in the still, fragile shape of something that might one day be called family. Angela had started physical therapy at a clinic nearby. Marco had made sure it was the best. Private, well-equipped, discreet. At first, Angela resisted being lifted and stretched by strangers. But eventually, with Matilda's encouragement and a therapist who treated her like a partner, she began to move. Small things, a toe flexed, a knee jerked, muscles firing like lights flickering after a storm. It wasn't progress she celebrated aloud, but Marco noticed the difference in her eyes, less guarded, less weighed by hopelessness. One afternoon, after a particularly long session, Angela surprised Marco. They were sitting outside, light breeze passing through the wisteria-covered pergola. "I still don't know what to call you," she said. Marco turned, unsure what she meant. "To Matilda, you're Mr. Marco, maybe even a little more. But to me, you're not just the man who saved my life anymore. You're not just the guy with the house. I don't want to cheapen it with words like benefactor. So I'm stuck." Marco smiled, slow and genuine. "Then don't call me anything yet. Call me what feels true when you're ready." Angela nodded. "That might take a while. I'm not going anywhere." Meanwhile, Matilda had started school again. A private academy nearby, recommended by one of Marco's contacts. Good school, bright spaces, small classes. But Matilda didn't slip into it easily. She was quiet, careful. She wore clothes too plain for the designer-clad crowd and spoke with softness that came from too many years of listening instead of being heard. One day she came home silent, eyes downcast. Angela knew something had happened. Later, Matilda admitted a boy in class had called her a charity case, asked if the man who bought her was her new dad. The words cut deeper than she let on. Angela was livid, but she saw the wear in her daughter's shoulders. That night, she tried to talk to Marco, not anger, but fear. Fear that this life was still on loan, that it could be revoked by whispers from people who never knew what it meant to survive. Marco listened carefully. Then he asked Matilda to join him in the garden. They sat by the small fountain, where koi drifted lazily below the surface. "You're not here because I felt sorry for you," Marco said. "You're here because I saw you. Because you and your mom showed me something worth holding on to. I don't care what some kid says. I care what you believe about yourself. And what I believe is that you belong here. Not as a guest, not as a favor. As family." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes, then she leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a while. A few weeks later, Matilda asked if she could plan something special. A small garden lunch for classmates. Angela was skeptical, but Matilda insisted. "If they can see us here, maybe they'll see more than what we were. Maybe they'll see what we're becoming." Marco helped set it up. Picnic tables, flower arrangements. He even baked lemon cake himself, something he hadn't done since his mother was alive. Angela, at Matilda's insistence, wore a soft green dress and had her hair styled. When she wheeled into the garden, sunlight catching her cheekbones, she didn't look like a patient. She looked like a woman coming back to herself. When the children arrived, Matilda welcomed them with shy pride. "This is my mom. She's the strongest person I know." Then she turned to Marco. "And this is Marco. He's family." Angela watched the words land. They weren't scripted. They were real. She felt them settle somewhere deep between the ache of loss and the warmth of hope. Later that night, after dishes were cleared and Matilda was asleep, Angela rolled into the kitchen where Marco was finishing tea. "I used to think needing someone meant weakness, that depending on anyone meant I'd failed. But now I think maybe real strength is knowing when to lean, when to let someone catch you." She paused. "I just want to say, I see you too." Marco turned, eyes soft. "We all need saving sometimes. Doesn't mean we're broken. Just means we're human." Angela smiled, not polite, real. One with edges and history and light. The house, once filled only with echoes, now pulsed with something slower, deeper. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days were harder. Angela still had pain. Matilda still doubted. Marco still questioned if he was doing enough. But together, in this patchwork family built from accident and grace, they found something neither wealth nor survival alone could offer. They found a new beginning. It was a Sunday morning when sunlight came gentle through the kitchen window and the air smelled of cinnamon and coffee. Matilda sat at the table scribbling on folded paper. Marco worked quietly by the stove, one hand on the pan, the other holding a wooden spoon with ease he'd only recently developed. Angela was nearby, hair pulled back, a book open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes. Her gaze rested on the two of them moving together in a rhythm she hadn't expected to find so ordinary, and that made it feel miraculous. Marco slid eggs onto a plate, glanced toward Angela. "You hungry?" She lifted her eyes, smiled faintly. "More than I thought I'd be." He set the plate before her, added toast and berries, then turned to Matilda. "And yours." The girl beamed. Angela watched them, chest warm. She still had pain, sometimes sharp, sometimes dull. But that morning, it didn't define her. It wasn't just medication or therapy. It was the way the silence had changed. It used to echo. Now it hummed with life. Later that afternoon, Marco found himself on the back patio pruning rose branches. He wasn't particularly good at gardening, but it helped calm his thoughts. Matilda joined him, flopping onto the bench edge. "Are we staying here forever?" she asked without looking up. "Do you want to?" She nodded. "Yeah, but I wasn't sure if you wanted us to, like for good." Marco set the clippers aside, turned to face her. "Matilda, there's no until in this house. There's just if we want to build something together." "And I do." She blinked, smiled wide, then hugged him without warning. Fast, tight, full of everything a child couldn't say aloud. That evening, after Matilda went to bed, Marco made tea and carried 2 mugs into the living room. Angela was by the fireplace, blanket across her lap, eyes closed. When he approached, she opened and timid them. "I've been thinking about something. I don't want you to feel like you're staying here because you have to. I want you both here because this feels like home, if you want it to be." Angela looked at him, quiet for a long moment. "When I was in the hospital, I used to dream of just one quiet morning with my daughter where we weren't counting bills or measuring pills. Now I have that. Because of you." Marco shook his head gently. "No, because you kept fighting. I just stood in the right place." "No, Marco, you chose not to walk away. That's a different kind of miracle." He set the tea beside her, then sat. "I meant what I said. This isn't charity. It's choice. Mine, yours, hers. So maybe we start calling this what it is. A family, not temporary, just real." Angela's throat tightened. Letting her pride lower felt like undressing in front of fire. But he had earned that trust. Not by offering, but by staying. She smiled, slow and real. "Then you better get used to burnt toast and teenage moods." He laughed, full and easy. "Deal." The next weekend, the three of them planted a lemon tree in the corner of the backyard. Marco dug the hole. Matilda lowered the roots. Angela held the hose steady. Small ceremony, but meaningful. Marco called it their second beginning. Angela called it grace. Matilda named the tree Lemonita. When a neighbor stopped by with misdelivered mail, Matilda opened the door proudly. "This is my home. That's my mom, and that's Marco. He's ours." No one corrected her, and no one ever would. In the amber light of late afternoon, as the three of them sat together on the patio watching the young lemon tree sway gently in the breeze, something settled into place. Not with fanfare or declaration, but with the quiet certainty of things finally finding where they belonged. Marco Santoro, who had spent decades building an empire in shadows, had found something more valuable than power or respect. He had found purpose wrapped in the laughter of a child and the gratitude of a woman who had learned to trust again. Angela looked at her daughter, then at the man beside them, and felt the weight she'd carried for so long finally begin to lift. Not disappear entirely, but lighten enough that she could imagine tomorrow without fear. Matilda, barefoot on the grass, turned to them both with a smile that held no shadows, only the bright, uncomplicated joy of a child who finally felt safe. And Marco, watching them, understood that this patchwork family built from desperation and choice, from theft and redemption, was the most honest thing he had ever built. No contracts, no leverage, just three people who had found each other in the chaos of a city that never stopped moving and decided against all odds to stay. The lemon tree would grow. Seasons would change. There would be hard days ahead, setbacks and struggles that couldn't be solved with phone calls or influence, but they would face them together, bound not by blood or obligation, but by something stronger, by the simple, profound choice to care. And in a house that had once been filled with nothing but expensive silence, there was now something far more valuable. There was home.